Okay, Nick, I will now turn it over to Nate, who is here with us today to talk about the ARP funds and what all is coming out of that. Nate, I'm yours.
Can you all hear me all right? All right. So I'm very happy to be here today. This is like coming back to see family that I haven't seen in a while. Nate Halubka. I work within the North Carolina Pandemic Recovery Office. Prior to that, worked in state parks, managed Parks and Rec Trust Fund, and then Parks Field for about 20 years. So what I'm going to go through today is I'm going to go through some high-level information for the ARPA-related funds, briefly touch on foreign relief funds, and then also kind of look very briefly into the future at the bipartisan infrastructure bill. Now, what I will say is I would like to keep this informal, and feel free to ask questions as we're going through this. What I would like you to do is hold off if you have specific allowable use questions, all right? So myself and Connor Cruz from the School of Government, I'll be around for the rest of the day, and I can answer some of those. But we also have, there's $30 million that went out to 3 stakeholder groups across the state. So the League of Municipalities, League of Municipalities, the Association of County Commissioners, and the Council of Governments. Each received $10 million to help with local government capacity. So they're really set up statutorily or legislatively to help you with those more specific questions. And then certainly the School of Government has already had some operations up to help with that. So if you have broader based questions, things that you'd like taken back up to the NRPA or to the U.S. Treasury or to the National Park Service, by all means, reach out and we can help those. Or if you just have some very general questions, but like I said, hold off on more specific questions. All right, so what I'm going to go through is first we're going to get through acronym soup. Federal funds are fun to work with until you don't know what you're actually talking about. At times I'll use UST to talk about the U.S. Treasury, OSBM, which is where NCPRO, the North Carolina Pandemic Recovery Office, is situated out of. Then I will also use the CRF to talk about the Corona Relief Funds. So those were those immediate relief funds that came out right whenever we're kind of at the beginning of the pandemic. Largely, those funds are kind of behind us. That allowable use period ended at the end of last year. And so now we're kind of gearing up and more into the American Rescue Plan Act funds, which those funds you can, we have a lot of ways that I think parks for a long time have been working with some of the major categories that are outlined within the ARPA. So a lot of this, I'm going to try and angle at what can you say to your council, to your commission, to the leaders in your community to make them understand ARPA through a parks lens. So I'm going to try and do that on an overview level. So I'm going to use that. So we have the American Rescue Plan Act, which is ARPA, but then within that, we kind of have 2 subsets. We have the local fiscal relief funds, which are talking about the funds that the U.S. Treasury gave directly to local governments or NEUs. And then we have the state fiscal relief funds, which those are the funds that the Treasury gave to states. And then through the recent budget that just passed, those are being passed out through. So sometimes there's local governments that are identified in both. Most of the time, your funds that you're working with are in that local fiscal relief category. Now, what I will say is both the local fiscal relief and the state fiscal relief both operate under the same guidelines. All right, they're both coming from the final rule. All right, so next up. So these are some of the things I'm going to go through briefly. I'm going to talk about the data uses, the final rule versus the interim final rule, revenue replacement, uniform guidance, partnering allowability, matching for other projects, capital replacement, premium programs, and looking ahead at the bipartisan infrastructure bill. I'm going to go through a lot of information very quickly. You're very much welcome to have the slides, and I've actually documented kind of where I'm pulling these things out. So if I go through something a little bit too quickly, I'm really just trying to make sure that we get through all this, and you're welcome to have the slides. All right, so just to let you know the kind of the timeline to spend. So like I said, we have local fiscal relief funds. Those are coming out in 2 tranches. So your local government has already received its first tranche. The second one will come out no sooner than 1 year from the date when they first got it. The allowable use to get these, you have to have them encumbered. So if a lot of local governments are looking at capital projects, you have to have it encumbered before the end of 2024. Now, if it's encumbered, so if you have a contract to actually roll something out, if you're going to build a park or something like that, you actually have until the end of 2026 to get that done. So if you're looking at using these ARPA funds to say match part or something like that, which is fine, and I'll get into it. then make sure that you get these funds encumbered before the end of 2024 and used before the end of 2026. We're already getting questions about whether or not Congress is going to extend that deadline. I will tell you with the Corona relief funds, they did extend it. They extended it 3 days for the end of the deadline. Don't wait until 3 days before the end of the deadline to hope that you get an extension. All right, so, and then again, we have $5.4 billion that's going to the state fiscal relief funds, and this is through all state agencies. So you also see some of the opportunities that you may have are coming through this. All right, so next up. So about a month and a half ago, the U.S. Treasury released what's called the final rule. It's a nice 400+ page light reading. So if anybody ever wants to sleep, feel free to read it. They also give us a 44-page summary of it. Now, what I want you to do is that they talk about 4 allowable uses in general terms within this. So I want to break these down really quickly and talk about where it's most useful for parks to understand these. So the key thing, if you don't take away anything else from this presentation, take away, make sure you're talking with your local government to make sure 95% of your local government should be claiming the $10 million revenue replacement opportunity. All right, there's still opportunities for parks to use it outside of that $10 million threshold. But if your local government isn't doing that, they're really hamstringing. The Treasury rolled that out to make it easier for local governments to use. The second thing is, and this is the one that I think really sets parks and rec departments across the state up to have positive dialogue with their local leaders, because it's talking about health and economic impacts. So the things that parks have been talking about, how they bring healthy activities to communities, how they help the local economy. This is something we've been saying for 20 years or more. The entire time I've been in my career, we've been talking about it. Unfortunately, it's taken a pandemic for our country to recognize that parks are part of this. And there's actually specific mention within the final rule where it talks about how parks are helping with public health and economic benefits. Even if it doesn't help you to get your funds that you want to right now, try that out, pull that up, talk to your council, talk to your commission about it, talk to your leadership to say, look, the federal government is saying we do these things. And even if it's not tied to a specific allotment, that gives you credibility whenever you're trying to do things even past her. So, and I'll give you more specific examples about how to frame that here in a bit. Premium pay. We have a lot of frontline staff that work a lot with public in dangerous situations. If you have staff or maintenance staff, you can help them with premium pay. If you have staff that are out there cleaning bathrooms, program staff that are working with the public on general levels. I know that there's a lot of discussion going on right now about how can I take these ARPA funds and build a park? Or how can I take these funds and build a greenway? That's great, and there are ways that you can do that. Don't forget your staff. The other thing is, how can I take these funds and implement a new program that helps a low impact or a disadvantaged population? How do I roll out a new health related program in my community? Well, you know what? You can take the ARPA funds and help do that. So don't think just narrowly within the, how can I build a park with these funds? Look at how programmatically you can use them, and then also look at how you can use this to help your staff. And then obviously the water and sewer infrastructure. I know that that says infrastructure in it, but honestly, if it's a park related thing, you're most likely to lump that under public health and economic impacts. Your infrastructure, water and sewer infrastructure, if you have a state park related, like a campground or something like that, or if you have, you know, a need for broadband in your area, in your park, that's a category. All right, so revenue replacement, I'm going to briefly go through this because I just talked about it. So your town, your local government falls under one of these 2 categories. All right, so you're either going to be claiming that $10 million off the top. Now, it doesn't give you additional funds. If your local government only got $8 million, you can't claim the $10 million and get an extra 2. You're capped at whatever that amount is. Other local governments may want to use you can still use a formulaic way of capturing revenue. This really is only relevant for the biggest of the big municipalities and counties and your state agencies, because otherwise you're going to end up getting less than that $10 million. So just keep that in mind. Now, what this does is this revenue replacement allows you to use the funds essentially for anything that a government operation would normally do, with 2 exceptions. You cannot use it to lower your taxes, and you can't use it to offsets your retirement, your pension plans. So just keep that in mind. I don't think any of you are proposed a project that actually lines up with that, and we'll actually talk about how that actually relates to uniform guidance. All right, next up, uniform guidance. Just because your local government is looking at using revenue replacement for a capital project or something like that, that doesn't get you out of having to do uniform guidance. So those federal requirements, 2 CRF, 2 CFR. I keep continuing. So we have a career relief fund. Anyway, 2 CFR 200. The federal regulations with that. Now, where this actually, and you can do that. You can set up your bidding requirements and everything to line up with this. We do get questions occasionally. Well, what if I have a project that's already being planned? We've already put it out the bid. We're already starting to do with it. Can I actually use the funds for this? Maybe. The question is, are you actually going to meet that uniform guidance for that project that's already kind of in the works? If not, you're probably best bet staying away from it so that you're not out of compliance with uniform guidance. All right, next up, combined projects are allowable. And the U.S. Treasury actually talks about this a good bit. What it sees is the opportunity, generational opportunity to use these funds to help build regions or networks to help each other. So look at a way, it's actually allowable and encouraged for you to work with other municipalities, with your county, with other entities to help get this the broadest impact possible. So your greenways that span multiple different jurisdictions, you absolutely can work together on that. We already know that ARPA allows you to work with multiple entities. There's no reason why you can't put together multiple related, or you can partner projects together. Now there are some things to think about. If you're looking at a nonprofit or a private entity, there's some actual state law restrictions about what you can and can't do with that. And I'm going to go through that in a little more depth, but just know that if that flag pops up there, hey, we want to work with a nonprofit on something or an entity, make sure that the flag goes up with that. Just make sure that you follow state law. Let's see, and I'm not going to go into depth with that because Congress. All right, leverage with ARPA funds. We're already starting to get a lot of questions about this. So what can you use the funds to partner with and what can't you? Let me take a pause here. I know I'm going super quick. Is there anything, we're about halfway done. Is there anything that I touched on in real a quick level that you'd like me to drill down a little bit more into? Otherwise, I'm going to go through quickly and then we can answer any questions that you have with a little more time. All right, I've y'all are either staring at the pretty parks or up there, which is, it's kind of a quiz show. For those of y'all that are like, geez, I got to tune out Nate. I've given you a quiz show to figure out what park it is. So, all right, so leverage of funds. There's just two blanket concepts that I want you to think about whenever you're looking at partnering. All right, so the interim final rule says that you can take the funds and match it. It's actually encouraged for you to basically leverage your funds. All right, you can, if it's a state-related grant, if it's a local-related grant, no problem. Okay, you can match it. So that includes the Parks and Rec Trust Fund. If you're one of those local governments that have been named as part of the recent legislation that's Complete Your Trails Fund, there's not really a matching requirement. You probably know if you're already part of this, but you can match with that. Parks and part of the equipment and facilities for the disabled. If y'all remember a few years back, we had the Connect Bond projects. So the recent budget had some similar type allow appropriations for it. It's still a 5-to-1 match. And I think Jill's here, maybe Chris is here too. They can talk in more depth about that. The Land and Water Fund, previously the Clean Water Management Trust Fund, has been renamed into the Land and Water Fund. So that's another state fund that you may be looking at. You can match for that. And the Coastal Beach Access, which is actually part of it. So all that's no problem. You can match with that, hands down. Now, the question comes up, can I match federal funds with this? If I'm looking at an RTP grant or I'm looking at an LWCF grant, can you do this? So with the interim final rule, the federal government was very standoffish about this. They didn't want that to happen. All right, so at first they're like, no, don't do that. And then they started to waver a little bit and said, oh, maybe. And now with the final rule, they're like, yeah, you can do this. If. All right, so where the if comes in is there's this, and this is buried in the final rule.
Not
You
the
can-
interim fund.
Not the interim final rule, it's buried in the final rule. One of, yeah, both are over around 400 pages. But in the final rule, where it talks about is you can match it for, this can be actually used as part of your local match, these ARPA funds. If the entity that you're working with, so the National Park Service, if they have requested a waiver to exempt themselves from this match, you can't use it. So what is right now, and where I don't know where the National Park Service is with this, there are members of leadership that are checking to see whether or not the National Park Service is requesting this waiver or are they not. So I would caution you to try and get some clarity on that before it happens, because if the National Park Service is provided this waiver, you won't be able to use your ARPA funds to match LPCF, which is sad. So just something for you to look at and talk to your leadership about. All right, and I put the documentation in where it's talking about you can and can't. See? All right, so if you remember way back, we talked about, wow, you can't see that at all. I can't even see that. Okay, so what the blurred mess up here is that you're looking at is, so if you remember, we talked about the social determinants of health and kind of setting your local government up to even past ARPA put themselves in a good spot. So one of the key kind of buzz phrases or words that are kind of working their way throughout all the country is the social determinants of health. Looking at that, providing health is more than just about can somebody get to a hospital or a doctor that does it. It's looking at how people are eating, it's looking about how they're educated, it's looking at how well their jobs pay, looking at their housing, and all those things, and there's actually 5 components of it, work their way into the social determinants of health. And specifically, this part here, section 3 is services to disproportionately impacted communities. That is a mouthful. What it's really talking about is what are you using these funds to do to help those social determinants of health? So if you're not looking at, and this is one that it would really do you well to bring this up with your local leadership. Learn about the social determinants of health, align what your department can help with in this area, and you will set yourself up for more than just the revenue replacement category. You will set yourself up for those programmatic things. To be able to offer programs to low impact area or to high need areas, to seniors within your area, to the obesity epidemic, all those type of things, all those things outside of the capital projects for parks are by and large largely going to be in this section. So make sure you read up and get informed with that. I did put the link in here so you can actually read it in English instead of whatever this.
We're going to post it on the course website. We'll have all your resources up there.
Yeah, so and the part of the reason why I bring that up is if you remember back, whenever the interim final rule was there, our office worked with RRS and with NCRPA to say, look, if you do these things within the interim final rule, you can really set yourself up to possibly be able to use your funds for a park. All right, and that's where we got into talking about qualified census tracts. And if you have a qualified census tract and you build a park within there, then you're good. All right, with the final rule, this goes away. Now, you can still point to your qualified census tract, but if you're in the revenue replacement category, this doesn't really matter. Ideally, you're serving some of these populations, but this goes away. If you're not in that revenue replacement category, you need to be able to talk about these qualified census tracts or what households you're trying to impact or what the federal benefit would be. So just keep that in mind and know that your plans are probably already lined up to help you with it. All right, so 2 more things, and I've already touched on this a little bit. Don't forget the premium pay opportunity for your maintenance, sanitation staff, and programs. And then just looking forward, and then I'm going to turn it over for questions or to talk to Connor, is ARPA is like front and center right now. They're projecting that the bipartisan infrastructure bill is possibly going to bring around almost $8 billion to the state. And there is, and I've gone ahead and put the page numbers within the legislation right now. The Treasury is still kind of working on how to roll this out. Well, there's some key parts. So memorize this for the bipartisan infrastructure. Active transportation network / fund. So this is, if you're familiar with bike paths, this is really where this is kind of coming into play. If you're looking at building a greenway, if you're looking at building a comprehensive trail network within your communities, the bipartisan infrastructure bill kind of lumps that into that active transportation network. It's things that are outside of a bus, outside of a railway network, outside of highways. And it actually gets a lot of focus within the bipartisan infrastructure bill. Now, I'm giving you that because that's kind of the next step. That's the Treasury is still working through this. You're knee deep in ARPA. This is the next thing up the line. All right, this is already passed. This is not part of that Build Back Better legislation that's kind of in talks within Congress. This already passed. So right now we're still waiting on Treasury. And then also this is probably a narrower subset, and this is the last point that I'll make before I turn it over to Connor. Some of y'all have parks that are tied to FERC. So if you have a park that has a FERC related dam within it, then you're probably working with Duke Energy or Progress Energy, and they have to give you some type of benefit to help your park since they're using that waterway. There's some language within that where they have to give you some additional funds through the bipartisan infrastructure bill to help kind of establish or grow those parks. So yes.
Did you say 8 to 9 billion?
No, the 7 to 8 billion. Yeah. So if by reference we had 3.3 and 5.4. So this is all ARPA funds. We're close to 9 billion in ARPA funds came into the state. This Build Back Better gets us close to 7 billion. And that 7 billion is really dedicated funds to the state. There's also tons of other grants out there that you'll have to direct apply for. So there's potentially way more than that. So Connor, I'm going to go ahead. Are there any questions, or would you like Connor to go through things and then we'll answer questions? Yes.
Okay, great. All right, you want to get So, good morning, everybody. My name is Connor Cruz. I'm a faculty member at the School of Government at Carolina. I just want to do a quick poll. How many people are from east of Raleigh, east of sort of I-95? Okay. How many people live between I-77 and I-95? Okay, and then west of I-77. Okay. Okay, good. I like to ask that question when I teach folks from North Carolina, where folks are from. So thank you very much. I'm going to talk this morning about the procurement rules that are applicable to the expenditure of ARPA dollars. And so when you're spending the money that you receive from the federal government, what rules do you have to follow? And why does that matter? And I'm going to talk a little bit about that. One caveat, I've got a 5-month-old at home, and so if I say something that doesn't make any sense, probably because I'm a little tired, so just raise your hand and say, that makes no sense, Connor. Please repeat that. I don't get it. So with that, let's get started. So we're going to talk briefly about state procurement laws. Who's familiar with competitive bidding laws in North Carolina for public entities? Anybody willing to raise their hand on that one? Okay, a few people. Good. So we're going to go through that. And then I'm going to talk about the federal grant procurement standards that are contained in what Nate called the uniform guidance. And that's a section of the Code of Federal Regulations that dictates how non-federal entities, meaning you, units of local government, have to spend federal grant monies that you receive. I'll talk also about some conflict of interest standards that are in the uniform guidance. You don't see okay?
Can you see? Sorry. I was trying to adjust it. Hang on. Trying to get it a little more. How's that? Much better? Okay.
I'm also an ophthalmologist, and this is a test of your eyesight.
I don't know. Is that good?
That's fine.
That's about where it was.
I
Okay.
wanna make sure people-
It looks better on the screen.
All right.
Sorry.
So let's talk first about what procurement is. Let's set the standard. What am I talking about here? I'm talking about the process that you have to follow as a public entity before you purchase a good or service. I'm not talking about the actual purchase. Separate the process that you follow from the eligibility and allowable costs. So there are a number of factors that would influence your decision as a unit of local government to buy something, right? We have state law, and I realize there's a lot of text here. You'll have these slides, and I'm not going to go through all of them in detail because they're meant to be a reference for you going forward. So you've got to abide by competitive bidding laws when you purchase a good or a service. Those don't apply to every purchase that you make. They apply to the purchase of some things and only above a certain dollar amount. You've also got to have legal authority to enter into the contract. So does state law, has the General Assembly given your unit to do the thing that you're trying to do? You have the authority to do that. Now, for you, building a park, you have clear legal authority to build things in parks, operate a parks and rec program. So that's not going to come up a lot of the time. But that might influence your decision on what you buy. Federal laws and regulations. The American Rescue Plan Act is a huge bill. The Fiscal Recovery Fund portion that gave money to states and local governments is actually pretty small. It's two sections of that act that Congress passed in March of 2021. Much of what we know actually comes from regulation. And so the Treasury Department promulgated, put together the regulations that interpret that broad grant of authority and that expenditure of money. And did so in that interim final rule, which is kind of a joke, right? Interim final, we're sort of there, but not to the end. And they just released the final rule, and they've given some guidance on how we spend this money. I have a white binder up there. It's that thick. It's double-sided, and still the final rule. It's about that big. And so that rule tells us how we can spend these dollars. And it doesn't answer all the questions that we have. There's still a lot of holes in it. But among other things, it says that when you buy something, when you buy a good or a service, so if you're entering into a construction contract to build something at your park, you've got to follow the Uniform Guidance Procurement Standards, all right? In addition to state law, because you're a public entity in North Carolina, you've also got to follow state law. Now, even if you follow state law and the federal guidance, your unit might have a local purchasing policy. If you're aware that your local unit has one, did you raise your hand? I bet more than that have one. But where your unit has authority to do that, to enter into a contract, your board might be more restrictive than federal or state law. So for instance, state law only requires you to get 3 bids for a construction contract in the formal range if it's over $500,000. Well, your board might say, well, we don't care what state law says. We're going to require that for anything over $30,000, which is more restrictive, in which case you've got to follow that local rule. Now, you also might just generally think, what is the best idea? How do we get good competition? How do we ensure fairness? That's another consideration when you decide to purchase a good or a service. How do you include segments of the community that may historically have been excluded from public procurement processes? So all of these things influence your decisions to buy a good or a service if you're a unit of local government in North Carolina. So I'm going to touch briefly on state procurement laws, and y'all probably know this, but this is a refresher for you. So to understand the process that you have to follow in North Carolina, you've got to know 2 things. You've got to know the type of the contract, and you've got to know the cost of that contract. So as I'll talk about, there are generally 4 types of contracts for public bidding purposes under North Carolina law. And the cost of the contract here, notice I didn't say cost of the item. I said cost of the contract. So if I go down to a dealership and I enter into a contract to buy 10 F-350s, the cost for competitive bidding purposes is not the cost of the individual F-350. It's 10, all right? It's the aggregate cost. Now, why does that matter? Because the cost affects the process that you have to follow. So if you know those two things, though, the type of contract that you have and the cost, you can figure out the procurement method, and each of those methods has certain requirements. So what are the four types under North Carolina law? The first is what we refer to as a purchase contract. The statutes call it the purchase of apparatus, supplies, materials, or equipment. Now, that statute was written in the early 30s, last century, right? And so most folks don't go around saying, I really need some apparatus today. But nonetheless, that's what it means. This means personal property. Another way to say it is this is stuff, all right? This is pencils, supplies, books, fire hoses, fire extinguishers. This is your basketballs, your hoops, that sort of thing. The second type of contract is a contract for construction or repair work, all right? The statutes do not define what construction or repair work is. I'm going to tell you in a couple of minutes how to distinguish a construction or repair contract from a general service contract. Okay? Because construction is a service, right? But you also get a thing at the end. You get an asset, a tangible asset that is delivered to you. And so you're buying stuff that's integrated into real property, right? But you're also paying for the folks that install that, right? So how do we distinguish that service from another generic service? I'll tell you how to do that. But this refers to vertical construction. So when we build a building, when we renovate an old building, or horizontal construction. So when we do water and sewer work, when we install broadband, when we build a road, right? So how do we distinguish a construction contract from a service contract? And the distinction is important, as we'll learn, because service contracts, if you're just using state money, it's local dollars, don't have to be competitively bid under North Carolina law. So the general rule of thumb is, does this scope of work require a general contractor or other specialized contractor to be involved? And we can determine that from the statute and the regulations of the licensing board for general contractors in North Carolina. They talk about when licensure is required to do certain things. Generally, if the cost of the work is over $30,000 and there's an alteration of some structure, you're going to have, that's going to be treated as a job that requires a licensed general contractor. So remember I said that construction or repair work is not defined under North Carolina law for competitive bidding purposes. That's how we interpret it. So in the absence of a definition, if something requires a license, treat it as a construction contract, not as a service contract. The third type of service, and there are many folks out there when I walk through the exhibition hall to get here this morning, that would fall under this, what we call the Mini Brooks Act. It's called the Mini Brooks Act because there's a big Brooks Act at the federal level. It was sponsored by a guy named Jack Brooks from Texas in the 60s and early 70s. But what it requires at the federal level is for engineers, land surveyors, and architects to be chosen on the basis of their qualifications for a job, not price. And so you might have heard something called a request for qualifications as opposed to a request for proposals. If you have one of these services under North Carolina law, as under federal law, you've got to issue a request for qualifications and choose that provider on the basis of their qualifications. You can't ask them to provide you a quote, and in fact, a price quote in the first solicitation. And in fact, if you do that, and an engineer responds to you or an architect responds to you with a fee quote, say, it'll cost me $30,000 to design this for you. That's actually a violation of their licensing board rules, and they can be subject to discipline by their licensing board. That's not your problem, that's their problem. But just know that as well. So this covers design services, engineering services, land surveying. We don't have time to get into today all of the alternative construction delivery methods, so things like design build, construction management, and risk. We might talk a little bit about that in the Q&A. But it also applies to the selection of those service providers as well under North Carolina law. So if you don't fall in those first three categories of contract, those first three types of contract, you fall in what we call the everything else bucket. All right, and no, don't go looking in the general statutes for the everything else chapter. You're not going to find it. People, I've had people do that, where they do Control F and on the General Assembly's website for everything else. It doesn't work. All right, it's just the fact that for these types of contracts, the competitive bidding statutes, which are contained in Chapter 143, don't apply. They're not mentioned. So in the absence of them being mentioned to be required to be competitively bid, you don't have to do it. So these are services, leases, all right, leases. And I want to distinguish a capital lease from an operational lease. All right, this is a right to use something over time, where you're not using up the whole life of the asset. If you are entering into a lease and you're using the entire economic value of the asset, you can talk to an accountant or your attorney about this. That is not considered to be in this everything else category. All right, that's a different scenario. If you purchase real property, you're not required to competitively bid. All right, real property in theory under the law is unique. All real property is different. I can't duplicate parcel 123 Main Street and ask for comparable bids as I can with a widget, right? I can get 5 quotes on a laptop. Can't do that necessarily with a specific piece of property. So now that you know the types of contracts under North Carolina law, let's move on to the second prong of our little equation to figure out the bidding method. So from $0 to $30,000, North Carolina law doesn't require you to do anything. Even if you have a purchase contract or a construction or repair contract, you can just go down the street and enter into a contract to buy $25,000 worth of X, no bidding process required. But once you hit $30,000 for the cost of a contract, or a purchase type contract for construction or repair, you've got to engage in what we call informal bidding. The threshold for formal bidding, the sealed bidding process, begins at $90,000 for a purchase contract under state law. That threshold is a little higher for construction or repair work, right? It's $500,000. Now, you might ask, where is the Mini Brooks Act services? Where is architectural or engineering services or surveying services? Those are treated differently. That qualifications-based selection process applies regardless of the cost of a contract. Okay, regardless of the cost of the contract. So it doesn't matter whether it costs $60,000 or $600,000. You've got to go through that process, subject to one exception, because it wouldn't be fun if we didn't have an exception, right? So this is often used chart that just puts these rules in a different illustration. So formal bidding, I'll talk about what formal bidding requires in a second. Informal bidding required a little bit below that. That Mini Brooks Act process applies regardless of cost. And then for outside of that, state law doesn't require competitive bidding, but your board might. And spoiler alert, for federal grant funds, there's a whole different system you've got to follow that says we're more restrictive. All right, we're more restrictive than state law. So what does informal bidding require? What does it require of you? Not a lot. All right. It just requires you to keep a record of bids, make some effort to get multiple quotes. You don't even have to get multiple quotes at the end of the day. And award the contract to the lowest responsible bidder. And that's a term of art. That's a legal term. I'll talk about what that means in just a minute. You don't have to advertise in any particular way. You don't have to get a minimum number of bids. You don't have to hold a public bid opening. You don't have to get governing board approval. Now, all those things might be required by local policy, but just state law alone is not going to require them. Okay? The lowest responsible bidder standard of award, and a standard of award constrains a unit of local government's ability to award a public contract. So when it's making the decision to award a contract, it has to follow this standard of award. How do you apply this? And this applies to any contract over $30,000 for the purchase of personal property or construction or repair work. So how do you apply this in practice? You look at the lowest cost bid that you receive. That's pretty easy. You ask, is that bid responsive? Does it meet all of the legal requirements that it's required to meet? I'll talk about in the formal context what statutes might impose there. Things like a payment and performance bond, for instance, was that included with the bid? And you ask, did it materially conform to our specifications? Okay, did they provide what we're looking for? And if they did, you can go on to ask, well, is this bidder responsible? Is this bidder responsible? And our courts have said that municipalities and counties are allowed to make inquiries into the skills, the abilities, and the resources of a bidder to do the work. So for instance, if I'm a city and I'm concerned about a contractor's cash flow, I don't want that contractor to go belly up midway through my job. Even if they provide me a performance bond, which secures their obligation to complete the job, a surety might come in and finish the job if they don't. I can still ask, do you have sufficient cash flow? Let me see your financial statements, because I want to make sure you're paying your subs and you're not going to go belly up midway through a construction job. The other thing you can ask about is their background, skills and abilities. You know, you and I, we're pretty smart people, right? We can probably figure out on a major highway construction project, we tried really hard how to submit the lowest responsive bid. If we've never built a major highway before, that doesn't make us responsible, right? So we're not required, if we're the public entity, to award that to somebody who's never done it. So once you get above the formal bidding range, North Carolina law, the reason it's called formal bidding is because it's a little bit more restrictive, a little bit more formal. You've got to advertise in a newspaper of general circulation, legal term, right? Which means a newspaper with paid subscribers in your jurisdiction. You've got to run an ad and let 7 days lapse in between the date upon which the ad runs and the date of your public bid opening. At that public bid opening, you've got to receive sealed bids, paper sealed bids. All right. Now, this has come up in COVID, during COVID sometimes. What if we don't want to have a public bid opening? Or what if we want to restrict access because of social distancing or what have you? The legislature didn't modify this at all. Didn't modify this at all. And so I and most other local government attorneys that I've talked to continue to believe that you have to allow people to come to bid opening. All right. And you can broadcast it on TV. You can put it on your YouTube page. The city of Asheville does that, for instance, and tell bidders, you'll see everything there. But technically, I don't think you can completely restrict access to a public bid opening. It could comply with the statute. You've got to award here as an informal bidding to the lowest responsible bidder. And the governing board for construction contracts has to specifically approve these, specifically approve the award. You can't go out and do this on your own. Right? You've got to take it before the governing board. For construction work, you've got to receive 3 bids, as well as receive 5% bid bond or security. What is a bid bond? It secures the bidder's obligation to actually sign the contract within 10 days of you awarding it. And if they don't sign it within 10 days, they back out and say, whoa, I actually can't do this for what I said. you were entitled to go to the surety company, say, I want 5% of the bid amount. Now, the surety company is going to turn around and sue the construction company, the general contractor. So that doesn't happen a whole lot, but just be aware that that's a requirement under state law. All right, so if you go out and want to hire one of those surveyors or architects or engineers, what do you have to do under North Carolina law? Well, first of all, you might be scratching your head and think, is this actually engineering or is this actually architectural work that we're having done? How do we make that determination? There are statutes that define what the practice of architecture, the practice of engineering, or the practice of land surveying is. So you can take a look at that and also contact the licensing board and say, I've got this job. I don't know whether I have to get a licensed person to do it. What do you think? Sometimes they'll talk to you, sometimes they won't. All right, but that's a good thing to ask. So if you have one of these services, and actually one note before I go on, landscape architecture is not covered. Landscape architecture is not covered. Right? The statute does not say landscape architecture, and that is a different scenario. That's just a service under North Carolina. But if you have one of these, you have to announce your requirements for the service that you're seeking. You have to make good faith efforts to notify MWBE firms, minority and women-owned business enterprise firms. You can get a list of those from the North Carolina Historically Underutilized Business Office, part of the Department of Administration, and you can reach out to them specifically. But you announce your requirements. So you can do that in the newspaper. You don't have to. You can just put it on your website. But you can't ask for a fee quote or say, I want a design for this building. Show me what you would do. You cannot do either of those. They can show you examples of past work that they've done. They're not permitted to respond with a fee quote or work product, new work product. So once you get those responses in, you make a determination on the basis of qualifications. So the standard of award is different than it is for the other types of contracts. You award to the best qualified. All right, so not on the basis of cost. Only after you've chosen the best qualified are you permitted to go to that architect or to that engineer and negotiate what the statute refers to as a fair and reasonable fee. There's no guidance on what that means. Lawyers love the term reasonable, right? So it would be a market rate for those services. Now, to confuse things, the legislature has put into place an optional exemption. So if you have a cost of one of these contracts that is going to be less than $50,000, and you know it's going to be less than $50,000, you can exercise an exemption to the Mini Growth Act and not follow the qualifications-based selection process, meaning you can just go out and say, I want a design, and I'm willing to pay $30,000 for it, and will you do it? You don't have to follow the qualifications-based selection process. If the estimated professional fee is less than $50,000, all right, and in that case, the statute directs you to exercise that exemption, quote, in writing. It doesn't say how that's to be done, but that can be done either in a staff memorandum. So you say, I hereby exercise the Mini Brooks Act exemption, and you put it in your file. Or if your policy addresses this, and it probably does, if you have a purchasing policy, you might have to go to the manager, you might have to go to the board and get approval to do this. It's also with respect to particular projects. You can't say, I hereby exempt all contracts in the future under $50,000. It has to be on a case-by-case basis. So you've got to say, I hereby exercise the exemption for the construction of X, Y, and Z at this location. Right? It can't be for all things under $50,000 on a going forward basis. All right, so even if we didn't get into the federal procurement standards, there's a lot to digest just with state law, right? Just with state law and what you have to do. Well, if you're using federal grant funds, and in particular, fiscal recovery funds under the American Rescue Plan Act, you've got to concern yourself with another layer of procurement rules. And I'll talk about what these apply to. So again, where do these standards come from? Where do they come from? And I think this is a source of confusion for a lot of people. So the American Rescue Plan Act is a federal statute, right? Federal act that was passed in 2021. It says nothing about procurement or the process that you have to follow. It doesn't say anything. If you just read section 602 and 603 for the state fiscal recovery fund and local fiscal recovery fund, you would learn nothing, right? Just allocates the money for specific purposes. And so the award terms and conditions, which Nate referenced, the units of local government in North Carolina have executed an assistance agreement, a signed contract with the U.S. Treasury that says we will do certain things. And one of the terms and conditions of that contract is that you'll follow the Uniform Guidance Procurement Standards. So, and a host of other federal rules. And so if you don't know your local government attorney and you're interested in using this money for something, you need to get to know them. You need to go to them and say, help us comply with this. There are a lot of state agencies and other constituents helping units comply with all these rules. But at the end of the day, each unit is responsible for its own compliance. So, if you are familiar with the uniform guidance, if you are familiar with it, know that it changed a little bit. So if you have a purchasing policy and it hasn't been updated after 2020, you need to take a look at it. We're working on developing some model procurement policies to incorporate these changes and other fiscal recovery fund items now, and hopefully that'll be out in the next month or so. Okay. So, if you're interested in taking a look at them, this is where they are, and you're going to have this. So one of the sources of confusion here, if you're using federal grant dollars, if you have served in the military, or if you have previously worked with the federal government, you might be familiar with something called the Federal Acquisition Regulation, all right, FAR. That's a very detailed regulation, all right, and it applies when the federal government itself is buying things. This is not the FAR. This is not the Federal Acquisition Regulations. Don't get those two confused. If somebody is a contractor at the federal level, all right, that doesn't necessarily make them a contractor to you. But the procurement standards are located in subpart D here. I'm not going to have time to go through it in detail, but I do want you to know a few things about this. And this will help you down the line with other federal grants too, not just ARPA money. So, when you're taking a look at these regulations, I realize there's a lot of text. It has a specific definition of contract. Specific definition of contract. So, when I talk about a contract, or we might talk about a contract in common speak, right? We might say that's a binding legal agreement, and each of us has obligations to the other to do or refrain from doing something under that contract. Contract is a defined term in subpart D. That's not what it means. A contract is a procurement contract. It's a contract, an agreement to buy goods or services entered into by a recipient or a sub-recipient. I'll tell you what that is in a minute. To buy goods or services. And when you enter into those contracts, that's when the federal grant procurement rules apply. A contractor is simply an entity that receives a contract. And this should be distinguished from a subaward. So Nate talked about the ability to make transfers to nonprofits. And that's specifically mentioned in the text of ARPA. And a subaward is not a contract. A subaward is not a contract. You might enter into what you and I call a contract in common speak, right? An agreement, a binding legal agreement, and in fact, you have to do that. But that's not subject to the same procurement standards. You don't have to competitively bid to make a subaward, all right, to a subrecipient nonprofit organization. If you are thinking about transferring funds to a nonprofit, stop. Don't rush into that. There's a whole host of regulations you have to follow to make that transfer, all right? You've got to enter into a subaward agreement, document that, and then you have responsibilities to oversee and manage your subrecipient's expenditure of those funds. That makes you, if you make that sort of transfer, what the regulation refers to as a pass-through entity. And you have an obligation, like I said, to monitor their expenditure of those funds. Among other things, you, as a pass-through entity, can get in trouble for that subrecipient's failure to follow the procurement rules. So if they're not competitively bidding in accordance with uniform guidance, that's a problem for you as a pass-through entity. So I mentioned this. These federal grant procurement standards apply to buying goods or services under a federal award or sub. You are a recipient in most cases of these local fiscal recovery funds, and sub-recipients receive sub-awards. You do not necessarily have to follow a bidding process to make a transfer to a nonprofit organization. All right, so there's a host of things here that I didn't intend to get to, but I wanted you to have because it details the federal grant procurement standards. And I like to show this little cat to people. It's a sad cat when people realize how many things they have to do to spend this money. But don't despair, all right? So I want to show you one thing. And if we had a couple more hours, we could do it. I know you're just so sad. But remember our procurement chart, right? Okay, that's state law. So unlike state law, right, we got that everything else category for services. It doesn't exist under the uniform guidance, all right? They treat services the same as everything else. You've got to competitively bid services. So even if you're using federal grant funds, you're using ARPA monies, and you're entering into a service with an independent contractor, you've got to competitively bid for that if it exceeds the micro purchase threshold. All right, another term. If it exceeds a micro purchase threshold. Generally speaking, that threshold, unlike North Carolina law, is $10,000, not $30,000. So if you have a service contract that's at $15,000, North Carolina law might say, well, you don't have to do anything with that. You can just go down the street and enter into that contract. Not so if you're using federal funds. So just beware. Same thing, same concept though. You might, if you're familiar with FAR, you also might be familiar with the concept of the simplified acquisition threshold. So that is the threshold above which a formal bidding process is required. So unlike North Carolina law, for construction at least, that's lower than $500,000. So you might have to engage in a formal bidding process, even though state law or your local policy might require it. I wrote them. I'm not going to go through this in detail because it's a lot, but there's a new optional ability to raise that micro purchase threshold to a level consistent with North Carolina law. This is new as of 2020. If you're interested in this, talk to your local council or your manager or finance director about this. I wrote a blog post about it that you can use in a template resolution that your board could adopt to put this into practice. It essentially would raise that $10,000 threshold to $30,000 for most things. All right, so it makes it consistent with state law. You will have these slides, right? They're pretty self-explanatory. And there's a great deal of information that I've given you in the various methods that apply to federal grant return, right?
Can they sign up for a course with you at USC?
One thing, we went through these, I went through these in the fall in the ARPA class that we did in Carolina, all right? And there were a number of state agency partners. This is online, and me talking about this is online. So you can watch that for free. Just go to the school government website. Yes, sir.
Talk to us a little bit about fixing ARPA, meeting the universal guidelines and state guidelines as it relates to preferred providers. What can and can't you do? Can you name a preferred provider?
Talk to me. What do you mean when you say preferred provider?
Let's say if you have a recreation amenity, a specific amenity, you want their product. We want their product specifically, but we're still going through the bidding process. Governments have done that, but how does that work? If you have, or is that even allowed?
That's a really good question. Thank you for asking. So, and I got to a good slot. So you might be familiar with the concept of a single source procurement. So a vendor comes to you and says, we're the only people that make this, and you're not going to find this anywhere else. And so you don't have to go through a competitive process. You can just buy from us. We're the only ones that make this. That's a high, I would caution you to not do that with federal grant funds. There are non-competitive procurement is viewed very negatively. And so even if you want that, first, don't name a preferred provider. You're not allowed to place restrictions on competition. The general idea is to have full and open competition. So even if you know you want something, the idea is to describe it in your specifications broadly. Describe it so that there could be competition, all right? And then you make the determination after the bidding process is conducted that you want to go with that provider. But I don't think it's wise to have a preferred provider identified that you retain on a non-competitive basis. That raises red flags. Yes.
If your architect, engineer, qualification, you said how can you come to location policy? What if you can't come to that? What if for whatever reason they are selecting them and because of the qualifications that are saying it's $1 million or something really outrageous? What do you need? You need to X company, what process do you go through to get out of select?
So typically what's done.
Can you kind of repeat the question for the?
Yeah, sure. So she asked, let's say you're hiring an architect, engineer, or surveyor, and you get to you identify them as the best qualified. You say, come to our office, we'll negotiate a fee. And they say, we want $1 gajillion. No way that's happening. So thanks very much, but goodbye. What do you do then? So you can move on to the next best qualified, all right? But only after you fail to do that. You don't have to do an entirely new process. And that's also allowed under the federal rules too. So you would just document that their fee was unreasonable. Yes, sir.
Service.
Great question. So you might know that under North Carolina law, not for services, right? North Carolina laws require services to be competitive. But if you're buying stuff, right, you might have had a cooperative purchasing arrangement where multiple entities come together and they bid something out. And if they have options for you to go bid. The uniform guidance doesn't directly address them. What it says is that units are encouraged to enter into interlocal agreements or intergovernmental agreements and to have shared sourcing arrangements. Some people have interpreted that to mean cooperative purchasing is permitted. The other side of that is that the cooperative, when they're bidding it out, has to follow all of the requirements under these federal rules that would otherwise be applicable to you. That can be really difficult for them to demonstrate. A lot of times, and they need to provide you all the documentation for you to make that determination. Your procurement folks can assist with that if you have it. But they've got to follow the uniform guidance rules when they bid out the contract. And if they didn't do that, you can't rely on the process. FEMA, you might be familiar with FEMA's public assistance program. They've released some guidance about cooperative purchasing with those dollars, right? It's not, one of the problems with ARPA and with the way this process is going is Treasury doesn't have great regulations. They don't deal with this stuff. And so we're cobbling together interpretations from EPA, FAA, FTA, what have you, and saying, we hope this is the interpretation for this. But again, that's why I think it's important in that type of case to consult with your attorney. At the end of the day, it's a risk analysis. Are we comfortable with the risk, the regulatory risk that we don't know the answer to this question if we're doing it anyway? So it's a long-winded answer to your question. That's how. So I'm past time, so I think, right? Yeah, for both of us, and I'll sit over here.
Got one in the back.
So,
Process for, we have a selection committee. They have to make a.
yeah, good question. So the question, and if others didn't hear it, the question was, if you're going through an RFP process, right, if you want to have an evaluation committee, whether that has to be composed solely of staff or whether outside folks can participate. I think you can have outside folks participate, but you should be aware of a rule in the uniform guidance. Back a bit. You should be aware of a rule that prohibits those folks. Those folks would be ineligible for any award of that contract or for resulting contract. So if you're involved in writing the specifications or the evaluation process, and you're on the private side, you cannot award, right, your own firm or any affiliated firm a contract. So that would be something to look out for. Is our involvement with this outside person, do they have ties to another company that they're directing the award to? That would raise red flags and then could potentially violate uniform guidance. But just having a private person involved is not.
You mentioned, is there any movement on the state level to increase that? Because I mean, $25,000 thresholds.
I've been asked that all, I don't know. I haven't seen, there were no bills introduced last session to raise it. From time to time, I think that there are proposals to do that, but if that's something that the best place to go is the local state house or state senate representative. That's who they hear these issues from, is their constituents in municipalities and counties. But no, I'm not aware of
You might also reach out to like the League of Municipalities or Association of County Commissioners to see if they have a law.
Only procuring Lansing Park Commission projects that can involve engineering or surveying or an architect, say, a park master plan, hire us to do. Where does that fall in the columns?
Yeah, that's in the everything else bucket of services. So it's just a service. And so what that means is under North Carolina law alone, unless the unit requires a competitive process, they can, if they don't require a competitive process, they can just contract directly with you without going through that for landscape architecture. That's not true if you're using federal grant dollars. They have to go through a competitive process to at least get quotes if it's above the micro purchase threshold, the cost of the contract. Does that make sense?
Yeah. And follow up to that, if they're just doing planning for a future park project, but then that park project may eventually get federal funding, they submit for LWCF. Should they cautionarily do an RFQ, even on that first phase of the planning of it? I guess it's, if they don't do an RFQ on that first phase, that could, make them out of compliance if they get
It could, because, and I'm not familiar with all the grant procurement rules that are applicable to LWCF, but just hypothetically, if you have a grant fund and they say, and this is the way FEMA works, like for public assistance, if you have a natural disaster and you take responses, if you take some action to respond to that disaster, you generally have to follow the uniform guidance procurement rules, even though you don't have the And so to be eligible for reimbursement, I would encourage you to follow the rules that we know, if there's a chance that it's favorable.
And if I can add to that, there is,